My name's Cole Alvis. I'm an actor and a theater creator. I'm Métis from the Turtle Mountains in Manitoba, and I'm the leader of the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance. It's an art service organization for Indigenous performance in Canada. The Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance claims space for all Indigenous performing artists. We have membership across Turtle Island, which is North America, in the form of Indigenous performing artists, individuals, Indigenous performing arts organizations, and allies. The allies are an integral part of IPA and the work that we do. We create resources and service our community from the artists and the organization's perspective. But in order to see those individuals and organizations have their work tour, have their work be shown, it does require support from our allies. So we do also build certain resources that create access points for individuals that are interested in engaging in Indigenous performance, but perhaps don't know how to begin. Inclusivity is a better word in my mind than diversity, because diversity can separate, whereas inclusivity does require a certain amount of space afforded to all people. A mentor of mine said, if you are working on systemic change, sectoral change, and it's going well, you're not doing something right. This is hard work. There's a reason why people are less inclusive, and it's not just because of ignorance or just because of prejudice. It's hard work, and often what it requires is the structure of the organization shifting, evolving, a rethinking of how is it that we do the things that we do, and from what worldview are we doing them? And that can be a challenge, particularly when funding is an issue, and particularly when resources are an issue. It gets really tempting to cut corners and just go for the easiest route. And often diverse practices are not easy, and therefore it makes sense to me why folks may not prioritize it. But I think the benefits of meaningful engagement with various communities will outweigh those cut corners, I think, in the long run. And that's something that I would like to impress upon is thinking about working in a way that doesn't seem efficient at the start in order to get somewhere much greater than where we're at now. I'm on the advisory committee for Equity in Theatre. It's a gender equity initiative that the Playwrights Guild of Canada has started. And we had a symposium recently, and one of the action items that came out of the symposium was infiltrating the boards across Canada and ensuring that there are people sitting on boards whom have inclusivity as part of their personal outlook. Because often when it comes to hiring, from a theatrical perspective, even the selection of the season needs to be run by a board. So there is a fair amount of power that structure has. And so if we can, all the way from the top, so not just the executive director, the artistic director, the leader of the organization, but the board that they then report to, if there are folks there that believe in the positivity that can come from diversity, I think that's where we'll start to see real change, whether it's for gender equity or really any type of inclusivity. I think some folks respond well to a bottom dollar pitch, and that can be a challenge, I think. It's not always an efficient way when you're reaching out to an underserved community or a community that has not had the same level of access to education and opportunities. Those candidates, while they may be strong in certain areas, have been operating under likely a certain level of disadvantage. And so there's often some professional development and training opportunities that are required. When you do invest in those types of hiring practices, and when I have, what I've experienced with my organization is there's a level of engagement with the broader community, or rather the specific community that individual comes from. And through that connection comes the opportunity to have more access to the cultural knowledge, more access to individuals from that community participating in whatever events it is that you're doing. And so when it comes to audience development for performing arts or increased engagement in whatever artistic practice you're looking at, that's where I think you can start to develop new audiences or engagers. When communities see themselves represented in the art or represented by the organization, they're more likely to participate. I think best practices around inclusivity initiatives often start with what are the goals of the organization, and particularly as it pertains to the community that organization operates within, and perhaps the communities that haven't had, for whatever reason, a level of access to that organization or to that arts practice. And when it comes to best practices, often I recommend an engagement process, a consultation process with the desired community that you would like to see an increase in engagement with. One of the main things that I think of around best practices is seeing artists or leaders from that community being given the opportunity to be leaders within your organization. So by that I mean having the opportunity to make decisions or to think critically around what is the programming or what is the direction that we're going, so that they're able to bring their cultural knowledge and their understanding of what the community responds to and is looking for. The organization that I run it's a national organization, but it has spotty membership. And by that I mean there's a lot of activity in sort of Toronto and Ontario and in Vancouver. So the North, the Maritimes, French-speaking Aboriginal artists, very low membership. And one of the things that I try to do is think of in what ways are we creating resources? In what ways are we serving the needs of folks in those regions so that they will want to be part of this organization? And so that's what I mean when I talk about consultation, is engaging with leaders and individuals in the community to ask them what it is that they need and how can our organization evolve in such a way that it then becomes something that they want to be a part of. So the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance is developing a resource. This doesn't yet exist, but a traditional protocol that is quite important is a land acknowledgement. So often when you come to see a play at Native Earth Performing Arts, they will come out and they will acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land. And that is a traditional practice. It shows a sign of respect, and it replaces, and whether that's an effective thing or not, a welcoming, which traditionally would be done by the people of this land. Based on colonization, that's not always possible. So if someone whose nation and people are from here are not available, one can acknowledge them in that absence. And so one of the resources that EAP is building is going out to specifically in the land that is now called Toronto, speaking with those original caretakers and asking how would you like to be acknowledged. we've done our research to identify who we think the nations are. And there are various ways that you can, in your acknowledgement, add by saying recorded and unrecorded, acknowledged and unacknowledged, because, of course, because of colonization, we don't know necessarily all of the nations that were through here. And so that resource that we're building starts by, again, asking the nation itself, what is the way that you would like to be acknowledged, and opening up our process, and even what the resource might end up looking like based on the response that we receive from these communities. And so this ultimately will be something that we can share with other performing arts groups that want to perform a land acknowledgement before the show, as well as other arts groups before important meetings that come through here, or really any time that you want to be bringing, that you really want to be bringing respect to the land and to the place. And so that I would use that as an example of best practices around resource building, and particularly as it pertains to engaging with community. So IPA has the great fortune of being able to engage Dr. Michael D'Angeli. This is an Indigenous woman from the West Coast who runs the Githayesk Dancers. She's a traditional dancer. She has training in visual arts and now has her PhD. And her PhD was on the intersection of Indigenous protocols and performance. So she's spent the last many years of her life being steeped in learning and developing the vocabulary around this. And so she was an excellent candidate when we had resources to hire someone that understands Indigenous protocols and performance. And so she works with us as a consultant, so that as we're coming up with these resources to share and create access points for non-Native or Indigenous folks that maybe aren't from that particular nation to be more familiar with protocols, there's the trust there that she understands the sensitivity around these things and the vocabulary in such a way that she can guide us through this process. One of the things that's quite sensitive about this type of resource building is that ceremony and tradition are living things that aren't necessarily meant to be written down into a document. From a traditional oral tradition perspective, folks in the community can be concerned around institutionalization of ceremony and tradition. And that's a concern of mine. And that's why we look to Michael and various other leaders and mentors to ensure that as we are moving towards something that will create more access points and encourage more inclusivity, we're doing it in such a way that it doesn't sell out a community or make light of something that is very personal and very sacred. A challenge that I think many people who are engaging in issues of inclusivity for the first time, a challenge is the level of distrust that's out there in certain communities. And that comes from years of being shut out and excluded. Particularly in Aboriginal communities, it can be a challenge to be the new person on the scene that would like to engage with the community. I think that's where I would like to speak about relationship building. I think to be inspired to have inclusive practices is, of course, an early step, but it is a long road, and it requires meaningful engagement, meaningful relationships, and a dedication that I'd like to describe around ally vocabulary, being a good ally. The way that I understand that is being an ally isn't something that you do once and then you get to wear the ally hat. Every day you have to prove that you are an ally, particularly depending on your degree of privilege in whatever relationship you're engaging in. And so that's a challenge and an opportunity for organizations to, every day, even when it's not convenient, check someone when they say something that may be inappropriate, or perhaps just aren't thinking of how that vocabulary or that verbiage is received from cultures that aren't necessarily their own. Measurement and evaluation makes me think immediately of worldview. Through which lens are we looking to decide when something is a success? And this is something that many of the Indigenous performing arts organizations and individuals that IPA represents encounter, particularly when it comes to reporting for funders or various other bodies that require a certain kind of bottom dollar, how well did you do this year type of response. And this relates to any and all inclusivity approach where the outcomes are not necessarily going to look great on a graph for the CADAC chart that you might be filling out for your operating, or the various other reporting that you might do. And I go back to worldview here because if we're thinking about community first, if we're thinking about meaningful engagements and developing work and art that has all of us moving forward together, that may not necessarily fit within a capitalist model. And so that's where a certain amount of creativity is required, and articulation, as far as telling the story of the work that you've done thus far, or the successes that you perceive and see in your organization and in the communities that you're engaging. That may not fit within those metrics. I think a certain amount of advocacy is required. I think that we have some work to do as far as explaining this to the funders and the various powers that be, so that we do acknowledge contributions and efforts and outcomes that may not show up on pie charts and graphs. And I don't immediately know how to do all of that, but I'm happy to help anyone that has ideas, because I think it is necessary and I think it's doable. It just requires, again, a change to the system with which we're operating. It's not easy to have inclusive practices and to engage in this, but it is worth it.